The adjourned meeting of December 3rd to order. Begin with a roll call vote. Mr. Tripp.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Mr. Legess.
Aye.
Mr. Olthoff. Mr. Hess.
Aye.
Mr. Tholen.
Aye.
Mrs. Polk. Mr. Snipes.
Aye.
Mr. Byrne.
Aye.
Mr. Seroy.
Aye.
Mr. Lear.
Aye. Present.
Mrs. Weber.
Present.
Mrs. Peters.
Present.
Mr. Payton. Mrs. Parker.
Present.
Ms. Dunbar.
Present.
Mr. Ritter.
Present.
Mr. Kinzinger.
Present.
Mr. Fairfield.
Present.
Mr. Zenz.
Present.
Ms. Haas.
Present.
Mr. Carrico.
Present.
Mr. Eckhoff.
Present.
Mr. Smith.
Present.
Mr. Swanson.
Present.
Ms. Zuccolo.
Present.
Mr. Wheeler.
Present.
We do have a quorum. First item on the agenda is the election of a temporary chairman. Call for nominations for temporary chairman. Mr. Lear.
I nominate Mr. Tripp.
We have not nomination for Mr. Tripp. Do we have a second to that nomination? Mrs. Weber.
I'll second the motion.
We have a nomination and a second. Are there any other nominations? Are there any other nominations? Last call. Are there any other nominations?
I nominate.
Okay. Then I would look for a motion for recognizing someone for nominations to be closed. Mr. Fairfield?
I'd like to make a nomination we close.
Okay, is there a second to that motion? Ms. Dunbar? Okay. All those in favor of closing the nominations?
Aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? Motion carried. Nominations are closed. We'll now have a roll call vote to elect the temporary chairman. Mr. Tripp?
Aye.
Mr. Washington?
Aye.
Mr. Legess?
Aye.
Mr. Hess?
Aye.
Mr. Tholen?
Aye.
Mr. Snipes?
Aye.
Mr. Byrne?
Aye.
Mr. Seroy?
Aye.
Mr. Lear?
Aye.
Mrs. Weber?
Aye.
Mrs. Peters?
Aye.
Mrs. Parker?
Aye.
Ms. Dunbar?
Aye.
Mr. Ritter?
Aye.
Mr. Kinzinger?
Aye.
Mr. Fairfield?
Aye.
Mr. Zenz?
Aye.
Ms. Haas?
Aye.
Mr. Carrico?
Aye.
Mr. Eckhoff?
Aye.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Mr. Swanson?
Aye.
Ms. Zuccolo?
Aye.
Mr. Wheeler?
Aye.
We have a temporary chairman. Come join us, Mr. Tripp.
Let's not be laughing. All right. I'll call for nomination for County Board Chairman. Mr. Kinzinger.
I nominate Andrew Wheeler as the next chairman of the Kankakee County Board.
Okay, is there a second to the motion? Mr. Washington? Second to the motion. Are there any other nominations? Are there any other nominations? Mr. Byrne?
I make the motion to close nomination.
I'm supposed to ask it one more time.
Oh.
Any other nominations? Mr. Byrne?
I make the motion to close nomination.
Okay,
I second.
Ms. Parker, seconds the motion. All those in favor of saying, or nomination for chairman, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, same sign. Motion carries. Nomination for county board are closed. We will now have a roll call to elect the county board chairman.
Mr. Tripp?
Aye.
Mr. Washington?
Aye.
Mr. Legess?
Aye.
Mr. Hess?
Aye.
Mr. Tholen?
Aye.
Mr. Snipes?
Aye.
Mr. Byrne?
Aye.
Mr. Seroy?
Aye.
Mr. Lear?
Aye.
Mrs. Weber?
Aye.
Mrs. Peters?
Aye.
Mrs. Parker?
Aye.
Ms. Dunbar?
Aye.
Mr. Ritter?
Aye.
Mr. Kinzinger?
Aye.
Mr. Fairfield?
Aye.
Mr. Zenz?
Aye.
Ms. Haas?
Aye.
Mr. Carrico?
Aye.
Mr. Eckhoff?
Aye.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Mr. Swanson?
Aye.
Ms. Zuccolo?
Aye.
Mr. Wheeler?
Aye.
Okay, I declare Andrew Wheeler elected county board chairman.
Taking that back. Thank you so much. Moving on, now we get into election of a vice chairman. I'd like to call for nomination of County Board Vice Chairman, Mr. Hess.
Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to nominate District 3 Representative Todd Searoyce for Vice Chairman.
For Vice Chairman. Do I have a second to that motion? Sorry, Mr. Legess in the back? Gotcha, he beat you on that one. Are there any other nominations? Any other nominations? Any other nominations? I'll entertain a motion to close nominations. Mrs. Haas, second to that? Mr. Eckhoff? All those in favor of closing nominations for Vice Chairman, say aye. Aye. Those opposed? Motion carries. We'll now have a roll call vote to elect the County Board Vice Chairman.
Mr. Tripp?
Aye.
Mr. Washington?
Aye.
Mr. Legess? Mr. Hess?
Aye.
Mr. Tholen?
Aye.
Mr. Snipes?
Aye.
Mr. Byrne?
Aye.
Mr. Seroy?
Present.
Mr. Lear?
Aye.
Mrs. Weber?
Aye.
Mrs. Peters?
Aye.
Ms. Parker?
Aye.
Ms. Dunbar?
Aye.
Mr. Ritter?
Aye.
Mr. Kinzinger?
Aye.
Mr. Fairfield?
Aye.
Mr. Zenz?
Aye.
Ms. Haas?
Aye.
Mr. Carrico?
Aye.
Mr. Eckhoff?
Aye.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Mr. Swanson?
Aye.
Ms. Zakulo?
Aye.
Mr. Wheeler?
Aye. Motion carries. Congratulations. So I wanted to personally thank Steve Lear for his service. He was a close ally or confidant in the last 2 years of fun, I would say. It was not very much fun at the very beginning, and we worked through a lot. We made a lot of strides. So thank you so much, Steve, for everything. And by the way, he's not going anywhere. He's going to have a pretty prominent position going forward. So with that, moving under committee presentations and resolutions, we need to fill Jim Stauffenberg's board seat. Can't obviously fill that adequately to start with, but we think we found a very good appointment. His name is John Featherling. He has been the chairman of the ZBA, the Zoning Board of Appeals, for the past 15 years. And we have somebody who understands planning and zoning moving into the board where, you know, admittedly, we're a little short in that area. So we're lucky to have him step forward, and I'm asking for a nomination for the appointment of John Featherling as District 7 Kankakee County Board member in replacement of Jim Stauffenberg. Is there a motion on the floor? Mr. Hess, a second. Mr. Washington. All those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? Thank you. Congratulations, Mr. Featherling. You can come up and join us. And Dan will administer the oath of office. You pretty much only have one choice for a seat, so that it's warm, yeah.
State your name.
I, John Featherling,
Having been appointed to the office
having been appointed to the office
of County Board Member, County Board 7
of County Board Member, County Board 7
in the County of Kankakee,
in the County of Kankakee,
do solemnly swear
do solemnly swear
that I will support the Constitution of the United States
that I will support the Constitution of the United States
and the Constitution of the State of Illinois,
and the Constitution of the State of Illinois,
and will faithfully discharge the duties
and faithfully discharge the duties
of the office of County Board Member
of the office of County Board Member
to the best of my ability.
to the best of my ability.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
Welcome. Yeah. You can come right around here, probably easier. Yeah.
You're in my chair.
Those in glass houses, right? So accordingly, we have a void on the ZBA. They have a meeting today, so we have to act. That's one of the reasons you see these things stacked up on the agenda. So we have the appointment of William Helm as the chairman to the Kankakee County Zoning Board of Appeals, and the appointment of Gene Rademacher as the vice chairman to the Kankakee County Zoning Board of Appeals. Those are members currently in standing. Mr. Helm is the vice chairman, I believe, right now, and so at the recommendation of Mr. Featherling and bringing that forward, we have good replacements. And we also need to find someone to fill that spot, and that would be the appointment of Dennis Martin to the Zoning Board of Appeals. So I'm asking for a motion to combine and approve those appointments. That would be Ms. Dunbar, second Mrs. Peters. Any questions about that? Alrighty, all those in favor?
Aye.
Those opposed? Motion carries. Normally, we don't have this much business to do with the full board or the election, but we have some things we have to get done, such as the next item, the general fund interfund borrowing authorization until November 30th, 2019. I believe that is the entire title. So I don't think we need to necessarily read that into the record, but we did approve this at finance. What this does, I guess at first I need a motion to approve, and then we can get into it. Mr. Byrne, second. I'm sorry, Mrs. Parker. Thank you. What this does is it basically authorizes the county to interfund borrow. We have a payroll on Friday, so we need to take care of this business. The auditor correctly pointed out that we can't wait until January, February, when we've traditionally done that in the past. So we've separated what we traditionally do, which is tie up last year's interfund borrowing, put a number on that. That's what we usually did, and then we authorized, the next year's interfund borrowing. We had to flip that because every 2 years we have a new board, and we can't make this decision until the new board sits down. So accordingly, next year we won't have to do this again. We'll be able to do it at the regular course of business in November. Just every 2 years we have to have this be part of our schedule. So is there any questions about any of that? We definitely are still in a borrow situation to meet payroll. We have to take here to go there. We have to wait for checks to come in for some of our out-of-county bed rental. We're in a much better position, but we still have to do it from time to time. Any questions? Alrighty, well, I'll tell you what, let's do a roll call vote on this one, please.
Mr. Tripp?
Aye.
Mr. Washington?
Aye.
Mr. Legess?
Aye.
Mr. Hess?
Aye.
Mr. Tholen?
Aye.
Mr. Snipes?
Aye.
Mr. Byrne?
Aye.
Mr. Seroy?
Aye.
Mr. Lear?
Aye.
Mrs. Weber?
Aye.
Mrs. Peters?
Aye.
Mrs. Parker?
Aye.
Ms. Dunbar?
Aye.
Mr. Ritter?
Aye.
Mr. Kinzinger?
Aye.
Mr. Fairfield?
Aye.
Mr. Zenz?
Aye.
Ms. Haas?
Aye.
Mr. Carrico?
Aye.
Mr. Eckhoff?
Aye.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Mr. Swanson?
Aye.
Ms. Zakulo?
Aye.
Mr. Featherling?
Aye.
Mr. Wheeler?
Aye, motion carries. The next item, authorizing the chairman of the Kankakee County Board to sign a collective bargaining agreement between Kankakee County and the International Union of Operating Engineers, Local 150, that's the Highway Department. First need a motion to approve that. Mr. Eckhoff, second. Mr. Tripp. Is there any comments on that from the negotiating team? Anybody? Mr. Tripp, do you have something? No? Okay. It was, an hour meeting? It was basically the same type of agreements that 2 hour. It was very quick, and it was the same type of agreements. We've got all of our labor partners on board with us through the next 4 or 5 years, I believe, or 3 or 4 now. We did some of these agreements at the beginning of the year. We're approving it here so we don't have to go do back pay. So we can, for the first payroll of the month, we can adjust everything and not have to go back. And it's a lot of work to do that on the payroll side in the computer system. So that's why I brought it to this meeting instead of waiting until next week. So any other questions? That's a roll call vote then.
Mr. Tripp?
Aye.
Mr. Washington?
Aye.
Mr. Legess?
Aye.
Mr. Hess?
Aye.
Mr. Tholen?
Aye.
Mr. Snipes?
Aye.
Mr. Byrne?
Aye.
Mr. Seroy?
Aye.
Mr. Lear?
Aye.
Mrs. Weber?
Aye.
Mrs. Peters?
Aye.
Mrs. Parker?
Aye.
Ms. Dunbar?
Aye.
Mr. Ritter?
Aye.
Mr. Kinzinger?
Aye.
Mr. Fairfield?
Aye.
Mr. Zenz?
Aye.
Ms. Haas?
Aye.
Mr. Carrico?
Aye.
Mr. Eckhoff?
Aye.
Mr. Smith?
Aye.
Mr. Swanson?
Aye.
Ms. Zakulu?
Aye.
Mr. Featherling?
Aye.
Mr. Wheeler?
Aye. Motion carries. Next item is the approval for a state of the county night meeting of the full county board for November 12th, 2019 at 5:30 p.m. This was something that we had talked about. Mr. Snipes brought up. Other people have said, you know, we've tried them in the past and we don't get a lot of participation. Well, why don't we put something on the calendar to make it so it's advantageous for the public to come in? And to me, a state of the county would be a good thing. So, you know, I've asked a few department heads, would you come in and present on your year in the county? So it seems like that'd be a nice start. If we get participation, maybe we start to bring this out to maybe a quarterly full board meeting just to see what happens. We don't want to jump in the deep end and commit to spending a bunch of money when 2 or 3 people show up. I'll entertain the motion because we have to, it's part of the county code, so we have to actually do this. And I think I'll allow Mr. Snipes, if you're making that motion. Yeah, I'm gonna make the motion. He'll make the motion in a second. Mr. Carrico, any other discussion on that item? So, well, Mr. Lear.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Have we considered what would be the best possibility in case we do have a crowd?
I'm thinking about the library across the street.
All right.
I have, you know, but without having that etched in stone, I didn't want to put it on this motion yet. We can do that, but
I think we ought to
prepare for that.
Make sure the board knows that
yeah,
we're thinking about the location might be different.
Right, and we may have different thoughts going forward. We've done it over there before some years ago about another subject. So, but we can talk about that. Mr. Snipes, did you have anything?
Yeah, I just want to say, I think it's a step in the right direction. I also think it's sometimes we can't get everything, but we can get baby steps, and certainly that's it's appropriate. I like the state of the county. That gives them the overall purview of kind of what the county does, and I think it's just a step in the right direction. So thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. I thought it was a good opportunity because we should have a good idea of our financial year end at that point as well. Because we could do, you know, a regular county board meeting, but at that point we should have a good idea what the year looked like. And most of what we do is financial in that aspect, so might be a good opportunity. All right, so we have the motion second. Mm-hmm. Okay, let's do a roll call vote on that one too, just to make sure. I tell you what, do you guys voice vote? We're not. Let me do a roll call just in case it costs us money to get the library. How about that? Because then I don't have to come back and vote on it again. Let's do a roll call, please.
Mr. Tripp.
Aye.
Mr. Washington.
Aye.
Mr. Lejets.
Aye.
Mr. Hess.
Aye.
Mr. Tholen.
Aye.
Mr. Snipes.
Aye.
Mr. Byrne.
Aye.
Mr. Seroy.
Aye.
Mr. Lear.
Aye.
Mrs. Weber.
Aye.
Mrs. Peters.
Aye.
Mrs. Parker.
Aye.
Ms. Dunbar.
Aye.
Mr. Ritter.
Aye.
Mr. Kinzinger.
Aye.
Mr. Fairfield.
Aye.
Mr. Zenz.
Aye.
Ms. Haas.
Aye.
Mr. Carrico.
Aye.
Mr. Eckhoff.
Aye.
Mr. Smith.
Aye.
Mr. Swanson.
Aye.
Ms. Zakulo.
Aye.
Mr. Featherling.
Aye.
Mr. Wheeler.
Aye. Motion carries. Under new business, the February 2019 county board meeting fell on a holiday. So part of the county code, it's the second Tuesday. We need to move that meeting. So I was moving it to the Monday instead of, you know, the day before. So I just need a motion to approve that move, if you will. Mr. Zenz, a second. Mr. Washington. All those in favor? Aye. Those opposed? Thank you. Now this one's kind of up to Executive and Finance Committee, but I wanted to bring it here because it's this month. When I was doing next year's calendar, I noticed that Executive and Finance were in the days right after Christmas, the 26th, 27th, pretty much the same thing this year. So for those committee members, would you like to have that week off and do the combined executive, then adjourn and do finance on the 20th? You see what I'm doing there? Because that'll be a Thursday. We'll have meetings Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and then no meetings the next week during Christmas. I didn't know if people were going to be at finance or, you know, they may be out of town, then they have to come back for a meeting or miss it. So I thought maybe it's a good idea. So it's more like a head nod, you know, or you know, the people on finance, and we're going to get committee assignments, but typically you would know if you're on the finance committee. But is that okay with the board that I move that? Because it's short notice, but I'd rather, and it'll get, if you have it hooked up to your phone, it'll update. But what we'll do is we start the meeting at 9. As soon as one is done, we'll adjourn, and then people will sit down, then we'll start the next meeting. So it is only one per diem, but hey, that's kind of what it is. You lose $70 on Christmas, right? Yeah. So is that, if that's okay with everybody, I'll make that change. Unless there's a negative drawback and people would like to voice that now. Okay, we'll make that change and then send it out. Just kind of pencil it in your books and it will be updated on the calendar. So Now, don't forget, after this, we have the committee assignments are upstairs. The donuts and muffins are upstairs. We had to entice you to come up one way. So, but yeah, if hope I see everybody up there, current board members, former board members, please come join us. You're welcome to obviously bring your family. So, with that, Mr. Snipes, you have anything?
Yeah, just one more thing, Mr. Chairman. In the nominating process, I have no objections to, but what I would like to see, kind of going forward, because I know we're on live stream, is those individuals that are being nominated, that we have a point of discussion where they can elucidate their vision for the year, kind of let people know where they're going, and also elucidate the past accomplishments if they helped the seat before and those new that's coming on or whatever. Kind of like what they would like to see this county go through or whatever. I know we rush through a lot of things, but I think it's a great opportunity if we take it to allow that discussion, and that it kind of allows you to share your vision as you go forward.
Anybody else? Alrighty, a motion to adjourn. Mr. Legess, a second. Mr. Mulhess. All those in favor? Those opposed? See you in a few minutes.